I'm declaring the founding of a brand new school of Canadian strategy for the 21st century. Now, by a brand new school, I don't mean a physical structure or an institution, although that should come before long, and it may not be me who creates it, perhaps, or hopefully not. I'm talking about a school of thinking, hopefully one that will attract many students and leaders over the course of the coming decades. And the inspiration for the founding of this new school of strategy comes from my sense of strategic panic, because Canada finds itself in a deep strategic pickle. Our two historical mentors, our superiors, our motherlands psychologically, our examples, our paragons, of course our brethren, on the one hand the United Kingdom and on the other hand the United States, have lost their political minds and their strategic minds as well. I hope that's clear to everyone. If it is clear, we're faced with a deep strategic pickle. And the choice is as follows. Either we continue to consciously or unconsciously follow them in the mind-losing direction, which strikes me as the general vector of recent government action in Ottawa. That is the consolidation of the colonial position for Canada in the context of absurd imperial masters or imperial examples. Or, in the alternative, to strike a new path, to think for ourselves. Of course, this latter course is far more scary. It's almost unprecedented in Canadian history because we've had reasonable peaceableness across the Canadian Kingdom for over 150 years. We've rarely had to fend for ourselves in a deep way, certainly not in war terms on the territory, but also not in terms of not only being alone, but being surrounded by crazy examples. This is compounded by the fact that we face wicked pressures of our own, even in the presence of reasonable states, if they existed. And famously, we discussed many times the ACRE framework, ACRE, right? A, C, R, and E, America, China, Russia, Europe, and Canada's pressures therein. How are we going to navigate that in the context of two historical allies that really have nothing to tell us and that won't necessarily be there to defend us? This is a brand new game for the 21st century, and we need a new school of thinking. The present school is woefully inadequate, in my view, in denial, and in its glorified state, it's consolidating the colonial position, and that will spell the end of us strategically this century, and it could happen quite fast. So what are the components of this new so-called school of Canadian strategy this century, this new school? Let me make them three. First, Canada shall become a term-setting country. Canadian strategy, that is, our action domestically and in the world, using all the instruments of state and society, will be consciously and self-consciously term-setting. We will be setting our own terms, and we will be driving terms internationally as best we can, but with real purpose. That is very different from Canadian history and different from the current psychology of the state and government. We will be term setting, and I'll return to that a little bit later in this short lecture. The second component is geography. It's going to be very self-consciously tied to our borders, our reality, which are very different from America, from Britain, from Europe, from all other states. I mentioned we have very specific pressures, wicked pressures. We must be real about them. And in the context of understanding our geography, and most Canadians unfortunately don't know our own geography, I would urge us to increasingly push north in our imagination. Push from Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and Vancouver up to Yukon, NWT in Nunavut. Push the imagination and expertise increasingly north, and that will give us a better sense of our geography, a better sense of our reality and our choices our pressure points this century. So second point, geography. I know it sounds 19th, even 18th century, but it's very real and very immanent in IMMANENT. Third point, Canadian strategy is not about niche ideas. I got a good idea. Why doesn't Canada do peacekeeping? Or why doesn't Canada do peace brokering? These are all interesting ideas, but they don't come from a sense of strategy. Strategy in the context of this new school of thinking for Canada is all about the corpus feeding the fingers. Remember, when you go back to the very first micro lectures we've had here for Global Brief over the last several months, we talked about the punch being informed, or the force of the punch being informed not by the wrist or the fingers, but indeed by the torso. Canada must self-consciously and very deliberately work on its torso in order to ensure that the energy of the punch is potent, both nationally and internationally. What does that mean? That means education. That means population. The nature of the population, the distribution, the overall quantum, institutions. Of course, that means military, diplomacy, intelligence services, the quality of our businesses, the quality of our media institutions, which are sorely wanting and lacking in this early 21st century, and I've spoken about that in a previous micro lecture. Languages. All of these things inform the torso, which then can lead to better not only performance in the fingers and the fist, but indeed a more capacious imagination, a larger sense of what Canada can do in the world. Right now our sense is this big, and yet the potential of the country is yay big. And that concerns not only national enjeu, but global enjeu. And so I return to the term setting idea. Term setting means just that. Let's be hockey players in the world. Let's be Bianca Andreescu in the world. Let's kick some ass for the good. Let's not do the aw shuck stuff. We haven't done anything. Let the superior country show us the way, and then we'll glorify after the fact. Self-minimizing, self-deprecating, but not necessarily achieving, and certainly not delivering on our own interests, imperatives, and against our own pressures. So 2 more points, both nons. First, Canadian strategy this century, the new school, will be strictly non-diasporic. What do I mean? It will be strictly Canadian in its orientation, in its psychology, in its interest. I live amongst all the diasporas. I am of the diasporas. I myself embody at least 3 or 4 diasporas. I've traveled all over the world. I've lived in several countries. I speak multiple languages. I swear in 20 languages when I play soccer. Friends from all over the world here in Canada. It is one of the great virtues of our country, and Toronto in particular, that we are of the global diasporas, and we live peaceably on this huge territory. However, when it comes to Canadian performance internationally, it is a poison on our national performance when we think, as we do today, that one's affections or affinities for country X ought to torque Canadian interests or performance in favor or against country X or Y. That is a strategic nonsense. We've come to use it for electoral purposes, migrating that logic into some sort of morality play and into total confusion today, whereby all our analytics, even on many countries, are torqued by diasporic pressures and narratives that have little to do with what I call a Canadian school of strategy. So non-diasporic, this will take time to develop. It will take time to develop the psychology, the languages necessary across all our population set, and indeed the stubbornness of thinking in strictly Canadian terms. What is a Canadian school of strategy? Second point, and to close, it will be non-moralistic. Evidently, it will be moral We will seek the moral high ground where it exists and where it's obvious. In most cases, it's not obvious. But it will be non-moralistic. That is to say, Canada will not be going around the world pretending that it is showing other countries how to live, or in the worst case, how to suck eggs. That is not our mission. I don't think we're sufficiently impressive to do it. And I don't think it's the right way to meet the world on reasonable terms and reasonable grounds. We will work with all countries around the world, regardless of tradition, to advance Canadian interests, Canadian performance, Canadian terms, and to improve the lot of humanity where it is possible, working with all of these countries according to their relative strengths and comparative advantages. And where they can complement us, all the better. But we will hopefully be speaking to all of them because we recognize we can learn as well. Enjoy your brief.